We have not spoken with Mr. Harley Schlanger since CTM episode 748 on May 26th of 2017. It just seems natural we should contact him now, and in light of all this craziness that's going on all over the place. Now, if you're new to Caravan to Midnight, or if you need a little refresher, Harley Schlanger has been a spokesperson for Lyndon LaRouche since 1999, in charge of operations for LaRouche PAC for Western United States from 1990 to 2016. He's a journalist for Executive Intelligence Review and presently works in the LaRouche office in Berlin, Germany. Has since 2016.
Yep.
So without further ado, we welcome back Mr. Harley Schlanger. Harley, it's been too long. Where have you been? We haven't talked to you for 3 years almost. This is insane. Over 3 years. This is crazy.
Yeah, we used to talk quite often, but I moved to Berlin in 2016, just before the election, and I've been continuing the work here, where I actually have a very interesting perspective, because I can look at the United States from Europe, but also I see Europe from the perspective of an American. And so people in the United States want to know what I think about Europe. People in Europe want to know what I think about the United States. And I think the fact that we haven't spoken for so long, we should get right into the topic, because there's a whole lot to talk about.
Well, you just let it rip. I've asked many times, I wonder what the opinion of the United States might be, being held by Europeans, watching everything from the Russian collusion to the Mueller report to the impeachment to the COVID-19 and now riots in the streets. So just take it away, Harley, and just give us what you got. I'm going to stay out of your way. I'll come in with a question every once in a while, but I'm pretty sure you know what you're doing. So just, in fact, I'm sure of it. So you just let it rip, okay?
Well, from Europe, you have a very bad perspective of America, because it's shaped largely by the major U.S. media. The New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN. CNN is seen by everyone here in Europe, and the British press. And as we at LaRouche PAC have been emphasizing, the whole Russiagate operation started with the British. The targeting of Donald Trump, because he represented a break with the old Bush-Obama paradigm of constant warfare, endless bailouts, globalized free trade policy, the dismantling of American industry and agriculture. And unfortunately, that's what the Europeans like. They like the free trade agreements. They like the climate change nonsense. They're sort of happy to see the United States suffering economically. And their view of Trump is the worst imaginable, that he's a racist, he's an autocrat, he's a nasty guy, he's a rich guy who doesn't care about anybody. And the irony is that the actual rebellion that elected Donald Trump president is going on in Europe, right under the eyes of the very people who are telling these fake stories about Donald Trump. For example, before there was the Trump election, you had Brexit. You have farmers marching in Belgium and Germany and France, at least until the COVID-19 hit. You had the Yellow Vest movement in France. You had the destruction of all the major political parties in Italy. In Germany, the Merkel's party, the CDU, had its lowest percentage total since 1947 in the last election. And their coalition partner, the Social Democrats, the so-called Socialist Party, had its worst percentage since the 1880s, when Bismarck was chancellor. So the parties in Europe are falling apart. The economy in Europe is falling apart. And the same kind of bailout policy as in the United States, for the Federal Reserve bailing out the speculators, is going on in Europe through the European Central Bank. And most importantly, in Europe, you have an attack on national sovereignty, just as you do from the opponents of Donald Trump in the United States. Now, one other aspect of this is that when I first got here, Europe was rocked by the refugee crisis. Now, what was going on with that? Well, the wars that were launched by the United States and fully supported by NATO were destroying countries, leaving people with no choice but to flee. And the argument that Assad of Syria caused the crisis is completely phony. Before the United States started arming the rebels, the so-called moderate rebels, who actually turn out to be the jihadists, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and so on, as Lieutenant General Michael Flynn exposed when he was at the Defense Intelligence Agency. Before that happened, people weren't leaving Syria. It was a calm place. It wasn't a great democratic country, but it was stable. People made a living. People were comfortable. There was religious tolerance. Unlike the groups that we supported, the American government supported, that wanted to kill Christians and Jews, and also Shia Muslims. So, John, the whole world has turned upside down since the last time we talked. And it's largely, there's an insurgency in the populations, distrust for the establishment, legitimately. We've watched with Russiagate a cascade of corrupt figures from the Obama administration, from the bowels of the bureaucracy, the long-term, what's really called the deep state, people, whether they're in the State Department, Defense Department, 2,000 Justice Department retirees lashing out against Attorney General Barr because he recognized the fraud in the case against Flynn and Roger Stone. So we're seeing these networks expose themselves. And what I find is that when you talk to people in Europe about the United States and you say, look, what Donald Trump says is that he wants the United States to have a government that works on the behalf of the interests of the American people, but he also wants you to have the same thing in Germany and Italy and France. People scratch their head and say, well, how come no one's telling me that? And so we have a problem with the media, we have a problem with the corruption of the establishment, and we have a lack of knowledge among most people who are played for fools and suckers with these various forms of identity politics and gang, counter-gang operations. So that's my view from Europe of what's going on, and I'm happy to talk to you about any of these topics.
Harley, who are the jihadis' backers?
Well,
because it's you know where I'm going with this.
Yeah. Take a look at the real evidence that emerged after Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama joined with the British and the French to destroy Libya. There was a flow of arms that went to the Libyan Islamic Shield, which was an organization which was an Al-Qaeda connection, a bin Laden connection. They started shipping those weapons through Turkey into Syria to the so-called moderate rebels. But who do the weapons go to? ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And so Michael Flynn wrote a series of memos as Defense Intelligence Agency chief, identifying this and pointing out that some of the so-called consultants and mercenary forces who were working with the CIA and other contract operations were aiding Al-Qaeda and ISIS in destroying Syria in the same way they had helped create the grounds for Al-Qaeda and ISIS to emerge in Iraq. What was Flynn's reward for this? He was fired by Obama. And so I think this gets right at the core of what Russiagate is about. Donald Trump wanted to bring in Michael Flynn, not just because he was opposed to Obama and Hillary Clinton, but because he knew what corruption there was in the intelligence community in the United States, what fraud there was. We weren't engaged in a war on terrorism. We were organizing the terrorists. And Trump said, let's sit down with Putin and work this thing out and crush the terrorists. And that was why Russiagate, one of the main reasons for Russiagate, overturning the Obama-Bush consensus on international policy.
I've said for many years, ISIS is us. Remember those photographs, the Israeli officers standing around when the pictures were taken, standing a little bit too close to the jihadis. Remember that video that was released showing a bunch of guys in ball caps sitting around in their canvas-backed and bottomed chairs, and Jihadi John's down there on a sound stage getting ready to execute an infidel, and then he simulates this and then tousles his hair and they break for lunch. There was that little deal, and then of course, there's just...
Don't forget John McCain going to Syria and having pictures taken with the leaders of the ISIS group there, and later McCain saying, "Oh, gee, I didn't know they were ISIS."
Oh yeah, sure you didn't.
So
he could just anybody could just walk into a meeting with McCain, right? And remember when the King of Jordan lost his mind because it got out into the news world that ISIS was being trained by CIA in Jordan?
Yeah. Well, and now the other factor in this, besides the direct CIA and British, don't forget the British on this. They were very much involved in this because this goes back to the British plan from the 1890s of how to keep the Middle East as a hotbed of instability. Don't forget also two British creations that are involved in this. You mentioned Israel. The Zionist expansionist movement, the radical Zionist crowd around Netanyahu, and the Saudis. It's called Saudi Arabia because the British put the Saud tribe in charge of it. And the Saudis and the Israelis were working together with the jihadists, with the CIA, to overturn the Saddam regime, to overturn the government of Assad. They tried to get rid of the Egyptian government with Mohammed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood. They did get rid of Gaddafi. They targeted all these countries. Why? Because these countries had a certain amount of revenue from oil, and they were actually investing in things like highways, transportation. Gaddafi was building a whole new clear water lake. They had free education. In Iraq, you had a Christian who was the vice president, and you had women who were heading up universities. So these were not regimes like the Saudis, where women aren't even allowed to apply for driver's licenses until just recently. And so for geopolitical reasons, the United States latched on to the British idea of using Islamic fundamentalists as our force to destabilize the region. Now, John, I know you'll know this, and probably some of your more astute listeners will. A lot of this goes back to the Carter administration and Zbigniew Brzezinski, the great chessboard, the technocratic society. Brzezinski came up with an idea which he actually stole from a British operative named Sir Bernard Lewis of the Arc of Crisis. Use Islamic fundamentalists against Russia and China. And so the United States helped to provoke the crisis. Brzezinski helped to provoke the crisis with the Iran Revolution, where the American military told the Iranian military not to stop Khomeini. And then shortly after that, a destabilization in Afghanistan that caused the Soviets to send troops in was used as the opportunity by the Bush administration. And the Bush was doing this behind Reagan's back, or maybe he convinced Reagan it was smart, but to set up American forces to back what became the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Bin Laden was an American operative in Afghanistan in the late 80s. So this is where the jihadists come from. British geopolitics laundered through a bunch of stupid Americans like Brzezinski, Paul Wolfowitz, Dick Cheney, the whole, what is it called, Project for a New American Century, the PNAC crowd. And what does it all boil down to? They believe that war is good. And it's not just so the defense sector makes money. That's a part of it. That's part of the military-industrial complex. But it's also because they want to distract the Americans from the looting that's going on of the Americans by the financial networks that support the military-industrial complex through these wars. If you have in your mind that the enemy is Russia, China, Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi, you'll ignore the fact that your paycheck is being ripped apart and looted every single month by the policies of the Federal Reserve, the IRS, and so on. So I think this is, you might call it the grand deception, but the whole idea of the war party is to distract you from the fact that you're being targeted by the same people.
Once again, the jihadis and their backers. Unbelievable. Unbelievable, but clearly true. So there is no single big paycheck involved for any of the players. It's just continual paychecks for somebody who profits from this. Is it just the usual, well, we develop a conflict here that stimulates military contracts there, and then who gets paid? What form is the payment in? Campaign contributions, things like that?
Yeah, it works on several levels. One thing, actually, let me just call your attention to this latest scam. The New York Times did a story over the weekend claiming that Russia was paying the Taliban a bounty for killing American soldiers in Afghanistan. And part of the story is that this is against Russia, but it's also targeting President Trump. Why isn't Trump doing something about it? And so who were the first people to attack him? Well, you have Nancy Pelosi, who said, I haven't been briefed on this, but this is outrageous. So right. Pelosi never needs an excuse to open her mouth. But Biden said that Trump is betraying the sacred honor we have to our soldiers to keep them out of harm's way. Yeah, like he's doing in Syria and Afghanistan. Whereas President Trump is saying, let's take our troops out, Biden is saying, let's keep them in. So you see the hypocrisy and fraud. But what I wanted to point to is the New York Times story, which is filled with the usual anonymous sources and fake intelligence reports, said that they started looking into this when they found a large supply of American dollars at a headquarters of the Taliban. Now, they immediately assumed this was given to the Taliban by Russia. Well, John, I'm sure you've read these stories of pallets of American dollars that are sent over to Iraq and Afghanistan that disappear. Some of them go into, they build a school for $50,000 and the other $5 million disappears. Some of it's taken as just graft and corruption by the contractors. That is the U.S. mercenary forces and intelligence forces and others. Some of it's laundered to who knows where. But the story here that you're asking about, the richest people in the world, the Davos billionaires, the World Economic Forum billionaires, are part of an interlocking corporate cartel, which includes the food cartel, the grain cartel, the oil cartel, raw material cartels, the banking cartel industry, big pharma. And they represent sort of a supranational government that's over and above the rights of any nation to control them. And for them, they have been engaged in creating a speculative casino out of the world's economy, while shutting down industry and science and technology in the United States and Western Europe. They're outsourcing jobs to poor countries, and they make profits from that. But it also means that the American people are forced into a hand-to-mouth existence, where it's estimated 40% of working Americans couldn't make it through the month without credit cards. And we're about to come to a point where credit cards are going to explode. There are going to be defaults, and this threatens the banking system. So what do? They use the coronavirus to push through the biggest bailout in modern history. And I think you and I first started talking when I was putting out stories in opposition to the 2008-2009 bailout. This makes that look like a penny ante game. $4 to $8 trillion off the top going to the banks through the Federal Reserve, handed out by whom? Larry Fink of BlackRock, the world's largest asset equity firm. So the money comes in huge volumes, and ultimately, here's the problem they have. In order to keep the game going, they've created huge amounts of debt, corporate debt. Corporate bonds, almost 50% of corporate bonds in the last 2 years are junk bond rated. They took over the repo market. The Federal Reserve took over the overnight lending market last September because there's a huge demand for liquidity. Why? To invest in new plant and equipment, to do job training, to hire new workers, to do research and development? No. So companies have money to buy their own stock so that the executives can get their bonuses. And so we've seen a flow of money into the speculative economy. And now with the bailout, it's actually doubling or tripling the total volume of debt. The existing levels of debt are unsustainable and unpayable. How are you going to cover it when you increase it, even if it's low interest rates? But what the trick is, that this means the people who have friends at the Fed, namely the money center banks that we're talking about, JP Morgan Chase, the London banks, the Rothschild bankers, and others, they're going to be able to get cheap Federal Reserve loans at 0%, maybe even negative interest rates. So that when the housing defaults start, the auto repossessions start, the credit card debt gets called in, they're going to be able to buy it up for a nickel on the dollar with free money from the Fed. And so they're going to come out on top of this, on top of the money they have, with all the assets of the American people. That's the scam that's being pulled. And that's why if President Trump understands the strategic situation, which I think he does, that he was attacked because he opposed the British-US policy in Russia, toward the jihadists and others, he needs to figure out what Wall Street is doing to manipulate the economy in such a way that they can throw him out, that he can be defeated, because that's his biggest vulnerability right now.
But Harley, there are so many of them. Is it possible to corral them all and prosecute them where necessary, or is this just going to be one of those washes that we usually get, where the wrongdoing is discovered, the graft is discovered, the corruption is discovered, so the person leaves their position, but that's pretty much all that happens to them, and they're replaced eventually, and the operation doesn't skip a beat? I mean, is it possible to punish enough people that it kind of takes the motivation out of those who would do likewise?
Well, there are two ways to do this. First of all, you have the Durham investigation, which hopefully will zero in on people like, I mean, it's already zeroing in on people like the corrupt FBI acting director, Andrew McCabe, Comey, Clapper, Brennan, Sally Yates, the acting attorney general, at a certain point when the decision was made to go with Russiagate. You know, the important stories coming out now of a January 4th, 2017 meeting at the Oval Office with Obama and Biden presiding, where the plan was laid out to go after Flynn and bring Flynn down as a way of going after Trump. So that story has to get out, and hopefully some of those people will go to trial. But here's the problem, John. How are you going to try them in front of a jury in Washington, D.C., which is where they're going to get tried? For example, Bill Barr, the Attorney General, made the point that he doesn't expect Obama will be indicted. Well, Barr is a good lawyer. He understands that even if you have an overwhelming case, you can't get a jury in Washington, D.C. that would convict Obama. But what you can do is expose who these guys are and get some of the lower level guys, expose the intent, because that's the important thing, not just the revenge or as victims, we demand a pound of flesh. We want to stop this, but we want to show why it was done. And then the other thing is you take the power away of the money supply, of the money control. And this is where Trump has to go. He's got to reintroduce Glass-Steagall, the banking separation bill, which is something Lyndon LaRouche fought for the last 10 years of his life. It was repealed in 1999 by Bill Clinton and Phil Gramm, two of your favorites. What did the repeal of Glass-Steagall do? It meant that banks could now use your deposits, your savings, your business accounts as the basis of leverage to borrow money to build up these huge debts. And if they lose, they get bailed out. But you're the ones who lose your houses, your credit cards, your security, and so on, your 401ks, your pension plans, and so on. If you have Glass-Steagall, we would protect the commercial banks, but not the investment banks. The investment bankers, the speculative swindlers, would have to eat their own losses. And that's where the power comes from. Why do you think they own the Congress? They own so many of these people in the so-called deep state, because the ones who are not on the direct payroll know that once they retire, they're going to be given a couple of plum positions on corporate boards, or, if you're an ex-CIA crooked guy, you end up on MSNBC or CNN. So if you take the money away from them, and that's what you have to do, go after the money, let the speculative debts crash on the heads of the speculators. At the same time, you create new credit that goes through the commercial banks into local economies to rebuild infrastructure, to rebuild industry, to make the cash available to mom and pop stores so they can keep operating. And then you get a real economic recovery, not a new stock bubble. So you have to attack the war party by going after their backers. And you find that the people who back the war party are the big financiers, the George Soroses, the Ford Foundation, most corporations. Who gives money to Black Lives Matter? doesn't come from poor African Americans. It comes from Soros, from the Ford Foundation, from, I think there's something like 200 of the Fortune 500 companies basically give between $100,000 and a couple $1,000,000 to these terrorist groups. So that's where you have to go. Go after the money.
What about the Rockefeller brothers?
Well, the original Rockefeller brothers are all dead now.
But I'm talking about their foundation.
Yeah, what they left in place was a machine that includes some of their offspring. But also, look, they bring in other people, like Jamie Dimon is not a Rockefeller, but he presides over J.P. Morgan Chase. He's one of the biggest crooks and swindlers in the country. And he's working directly with the head of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, to make sure that the bailout gets to J.P. Morgan Chase because they have such a vulnerability in their derivatives holdings. Citibank, which has always been, it used to be National City. It was the second bank next to J.P. Morgan back in the 30s when the Pecora hearings investigated who crashed the stock market in 1929. Citibank has a huge amount of unsustainable leverage. Bank of America, Moynihan is not a Rockefeller, but in terms of the way he thinks, he's on the same level. And then these intersect the international institutions. And let me throw in another wrinkle here that gets right to the point as well. The international banking community is pulling out of industry. They're using the so-called global warming hoax that man-made industry and autos and that we eat too much meat, that's causing the realignment of the planet so that we're having hotter temperatures, supposedly. But what they're doing is they're financing green financial bubbles. And the person who's in charge of that is a man named Mark Carney, who until recently was the head of the Bank of England, who replaced former Mayor Bloomberg as the UN climate change guru. And what Carney did is he got 200 major banks to agree that they will not loan any money to any company that has a carbon footprint. In other words, it produces anything. And this is to be phased in over the next 10 years. And this is what Larry Fink of BlackRock calls a regime change in finance. So their intention is to shut down the growth of the US economy, to go into this green financial bubble. And what's the ultimate goal? Reduce population. Their view has always been, and this goes back to the Rockefellers, Lawrence Rockefeller, John D. III, John D. Jr. They always said there are too many people, and we've got to figure out ways to reduce the population. Well, this is how they're doing it, with war and with financial manipulations. And that's their goal.
So they just called their, this is probably pretty simplistic, but so somebody called somebody. I heard that CIA paid a visit to the Wuhan lab over there. I don't know to what personally delivered the message. Go ahead and let it out. Do we think the Chinese infected a bunch of their people, put them on airplanes and sent them all over the place? Yeah, I do. And so that's what this was all about. Notice how the stock market was slightly above 27,000. Then it fell to about 16. A couple of weeks later, it was right back up at 26. How does that even happen? How do you have a crash of 11,000 points and then recover in less than 30 days? Way less than 30 days.
I just wrote an article on this, which if your listeners would like it, they can send me an email to my personal email address, and I'll send them a link to my blog. It's called Why a Stock Market Recovery is Not a Sign of a Healthy Economy. So they just write to harleysch@gmail.com, and I'll send them a link for free to my blog. But actually, the numbers are a little bit more extreme. It was almost at 30,000, the Dow Jones. It fell down just below 20,000, and just recently it went back up to almost 26,000. Now, how does that happen? Free money to speculators. The Federal Reserve is giving money to the largest banks who are giving it to their favored clients. And here's the fraud in this so-called V-shaped recovery that people like Larry Kudlow are talking about. if you're an average working stiff who's lost his job because of the coronavirus crisis, the lockdown, you don't have funds to go out and buy stocks. So if the stock market goes up, who's going to benefit? The people who have a friend to chase. You know, the few million people, maybe a few 100,000 people at the upper 1% of the earning brackets. They're going to make a huge fortune. The average person can't participate because they're stuck paying mortgages, car loans, student debt, trying to eat, pay for medical costs, and they have no savings left. So, you know, to get at this real problem. And by the way, the story that the Chinese sent people all over the world with coronavirus, let me just tell you, that came from a British historian named Niall Ferguson. And he wrote a story that was published everywhere about how planes were leaving from Wuhan with infected people up until February 11th. The reality is that someone who fact-checked that found that the Chinese shut down all travel out of Wuhan on January 23rd, which was when they concluded that this was moving into a pandemic phase. So Professor Ferguson, rather than admitting he made a mistake, and the person who did the fact check checked the logs of every airline and found that there were no international travel going out of Wuhan after the 23rd. But someone told this to Trump. And what I think, and this is a very dirty operation, John, Trump was about to move to phase 2 on the trade deal with China, which would have been a great benefit to American farmers, but also to heavy manufacturing, the Caterpillar, John Deere. The Chinese are trying to upgrade infrastructure and need American support for that. Phase 2 would have brought a whole flow of dollars back to the US to these companies. And what's going on is there are people trying to sabotage that with this anti-China line. Now, that's not to say China did everything perfect on the handling of the virus, but you know, the idea that the Chinese deliberately unleashed this on the world, if you really want to look at who would do that, look at the people we were talking about before, the Bill Gateses, the Davos billionaires. They're the ones who have an incentive to destroy nations and reduce the population. So I think that's that there's a geopolitical story that's put in there to manipulate Trump in a way that's going to hurt him with some of his real supporters among the industrial workforce and farmers.
All right, sorry, I don't mean to be slow to catch on here, but how did it spread all over the place then? Or did it spread all over the place?
Yeah, I mean, here's the problem you have. The Western countries that we pride ourselves in our science and healthcare, we've destroyed the public health sector with austerity over the last 30 years. In the United States, we used to have something called the Hill-Burton standard for how many hospital beds per 100,000 people. We're now at half the level that was. Obamacare did an enormous damage to public health in the United States. And so once the disease started spreading, as these things do, you know, a lot of for example, in Italy, my associates in Italy tell me that it wasn't Chinese coming to Italy as much as it was Italians who had been in China and came back to Italy with it. But there were Chinese tourists. And, you know, many people, by the nature of this disease, apparently, you don't know for a couple of weeks that you have it. So the spread was something that was occurring that would have occurred naturally. And in fact, elements of the intelligence community that I trust, who actually know something about this, have concluded that it wasn't the Chinese that spread it, but that it was natural. The problem was we didn't have the healthcare system in the West in place to deal with it initially. Remember, the Chinese on January 13th said this is an epidemic that could become a pandemic. We didn't start doing anything about it in the United States till the middle of March. We had 2 months where we could have prepared. Here in Germany, the health minister said, oh, the German health system is so strong, no one's going to get it. So I think there was a blindness in the West. Now, are there bad players in China? Yeah. But is this a cause for war or to blame the Chinese? Why don't we take a look at the culprits we were talking about earlier, the Gateses and the Jeff Bezos, the owner of the Washington Post and Amazon, Ted Turner, the green billionaires who are committed to population reduction, people like Mark Carney, Prince Philip. Prince Philip has said if he could come back through reincarnation, he'd like to come back as a deadly virus to do something about overpopulation in the world. And LaRouche always used to say, why doesn't he start with himself?
Yeah, I completely agree. Do you know, I don't know how, you can give me your impressions about this, but, going back to the British and then this thing with American troops in Afghanistan, I am to talk with an Afghan who was scared to death to talk to me. And he told me that U.S. forces were taking fire from British forces. That's what he told me. And he did not want to give his phone number. He did not want to take my number. He looked scared to death. He's a delivery guy now because he's got one brother left. The rest of his family got assassinated. A hit squad went in there and got him when they found out that he and I think it was just himself, but that's enough to get his whole family killed except for his brother. The Taliban found out that he was working for the Americans and killed them all.
Here's an interesting point on that. As you know, we published many years ago a book called Dope Incorporated, which identified the British international banking system as at the center of the drug money laundering worldwide, like Hong Kong Shanghai Bank and banks like that, Standard and Chartered. Now, the area of Afghanistan where the British were primarily deployed was the area where a deal was made with the Taliban to allow the poppy fields to stay intact. And it was during the fighting in the Afghan war after U.S. troops went there that U.S. soldiers were reporting that instead of attacking the poppy fields, which provided income for the Taliban, they were being protected. And when they investigated it, who was protecting it? It was British troops. Because this is part of the long-term British strategy to use the United States as a military force to defend the interlocking corporate boards that are run by the City of London and Wall Street, and now by Brussels, the European Central Bank in Frankfurt and the European Union operation. Now, here's another interesting point for you. People in the City of London were worried that Brexit would mean they would lose their position in Brussels, where they launder money and they make huge amounts of money in covering the derivative markets and so on. So a special exemption was given to British banks that after Brexit, they would still be able to operate as the major banks in the global derivative trade run out of Frankfurt and Brussels. So for people who don't believe that the British still play a role, that the British Empire is so 19th century, they're missing a point. And here's another aspect of that. The CIA was set up by the Special Operations Executive under Sir William Stevenson at the end of World War II. There was a different conception that Roosevelt had and Wild Bill Donovan had for the CIA coming out of the OSS, which was sabotaged. And it was turned into a Cold War instrument that helped, among other things, Nazis escape from Europe with gold. That was part of the role of Allen Dulles, who I still believe was the person who, at least if he didn't run it, was most involved in the Kennedy assassination, and certainly as the head of the Warren Commission report, Dulles, who, remember, he was CIA director under Kennedy, and Kennedy fired him after the Bay of Pigs fiasco. Dulles still had those Nazi networks working with him, assassination teams in Italy and Spain, in South America. And I think that was the network that targeted Kennedy, because Kennedy was opposing the whole British banking system.
I don't have it on me, but I have seen a picture. I may actually have the picture of George H.W. Bush in 1963 on November 22nd, hanging around down by the School Book Depository building, looking like a young, tough guy. And that's where he was, and he just couldn't remember. He was always CIA.
Well, that goes back to the 50s and the operations in Cuba where they first supported Castro. And his company, and for the moment I can't remember the name, but he had an offshore oil company that was basically an arms depot for various operations in Cuba. So it wasn't such a big surprise when he was appointed head of the CIA I think it was under Nixon. Bush served a little while as a CIA director.
Yeah. I guess to just get everything in place, get things tidy, and then bail out of it, right?
Well, then where was he deployed after that? To the special position that we didn't have an ambassador then, but he was the first ambassador, I think, to China. And he was also head of the Republican Party when the Republicans turned on Nixon. So there's obviously another story to Watergate that we haven't seen yet. John, it's very interesting. One of the reasons that the targeting of Trump and Putin has taken place is that Putin is doing some interesting things. Not only was he very much involved in crushing the terrorists in Syria, but he had the Russian generals coordinating with the good American generals in Syria. And that's why we were able to defeat ISIS and Al-Qaeda there. But Putin just did something the other day. He released a document on World War II. And he said, in Russia, we're releasing all the archives from World War II that show who in governments were working with the Nazis and why, including the British, including the Rockefellers, who had their own trust agreement with E.G. Farben, including the Harriman family and the father of George H.W. Bush, Prescott Bush, who ran a bank called the Union Bank Corporation of New York, which was seized in 1942 under the Trading with the Enemy Act. They were funding Hitler up until 1942. So Putin said, let's declassify all these documents in every country. And of course, that brings up why we haven't yet had the Kennedy assassination documents declassified, the 9/11 documents declassified, and so on. So I think if we were to get a second term for Trump, it would be incumbent upon the American people to insist that he declassify all of these documents. You want to drain the swamp? Show what they've been doing for the last 100 years. Bring out all the reports of monetary fraud, pedophilia, murders and assassinations, and in this case, the LaRouche case would come up because LaRouche was working with Ronald Reagan in 1982. Reagan deployed LaRouche to talk to the Russians about what became the Strategic Defense Initiative. LaRouche was actually vetted and given a position with the National Security Council then. And because of that, the British sent a message to Kissinger saying, we think LaRouche is a communist agent influencing Reagan. And remember, Reagan then endorsed LaRouche's idea of the SDI. And the Get LaRouche Task Force grew out of that, from the British to Kissinger to Daniel Patrick Moynihan in the Democratic Party to the FBI. Do you know who was assigned the LaRouche case in Boston, the Get LaRouche Task Force in 1986? Robert Mueller.
Oh, why am I not surprised to hear this news?
Well, this is fascinating story because Mueller botched the case just as he did the Russiagate case. The jury would have voted 12-0 had the judge not thrown the case out of court. But what did they do? They moved it to Alexandria, Virginia for a home court jury, and LaRouche was given a 15-year sentence, of which he served 5 years. What was his crime? Exposing the same networks in the CIA, the FBI, the Democratic Party, and the Republican Party that are part of the Never Trump team. And had LaRouche been given justice back at that time, we never would have had a Russiagate. So we know it. I know it from the inside. I actually was subpoenaed by Robert Mueller in 1987. I was in charge of one of our distributors that distributed literature, and we were ordered by the court to send all our financial documents to the court in Boston. So we sent over 6,000 boxes of documents, receipts, credit card chits, the whole thing, to Boston. The FBI grabbed it, took it to a warehouse in Connecticut, and told the court they never received it. So Mueller issued an order that I be held in contempt and flown from Houston, Texas in handcuffs to Boston to stand trial. And fortunately, someone tipped us off. I wasn't around when the federal marshals showed up. And on Monday, our attorney got that crushed by the judge who realized it was a fraud. But we knew the Mueller MO from the beginning. And we saw it again with the attack on Manafort, the attack on Roger Stone, the Flynn case. This was nothing. There was nothing to this whole Russiagate except lies. And John, I'm sure you understand the importance of the role that Adam Schiff played by sitting on the 53 interviews that took place before his committee in secret, where one after another, people who were publicly saying Trump was working for Putin admitted they had no evidence of that. And the granddaddy lie of them all, that the Russians hacked the election, the company CrowdStrike, that was the cyber security firm, the president of CrowdStrike admitted before the House Intelligence Committee that there was no evidence that any files were hacked from the DNC, from Podesta, from the Clinton campaign. And so Bill Binney, the former technical expert for the NSA, is proven right. He said it was an inside job. And the name Mark Rich comes up on that, doesn't it?
Oh, Seth Rich. Isn't that something?
Seth Rich. Yeah, Mark Rich was Clinton's buddy, swindler.
Yeah, no, that's okay. And the FBI did have a file on Seth Rich, and they denied knowing anything about it. You know, the problem with this, Harley, is it seems that it is, I mean, this is like biblical level big almost. You know what I mean? Is it possible to purge all of these rats? Is it just too far gone to recover? I worry about that a little bit, because all of these connected people, and they're so insulated, and they've been doing it for so long. Is there any fixing this?
Lyndon LaRouche once said that the moral fitness to survive will be tested of the American people. That what made America great was that we have institutions of self-government, and that in periods of crisis, we've had leaders emerge who have rallied the population, or in some cases were moved by the population to act for the general welfare, which is what our Constitution says we should be doing. The whole point of a government is to act for the general welfare, not for private interests. So you look at things like the Federal Reserve. What's their mandate? It's to protect the private banks, especially the big banks. You look at the various agencies of government. They protect the big corporate cartels. Every once in a while, they do a showcase trial to make it look like they're trying to help the people, but they don't. So the question that's posed by this crisis, John, is that this is not just in the United States, it's international. This is a systemic collapse. The whole post-Cold War system, and even you could go back to the post-1971 system when Nixon took the dollar off gold reserve and ended the fixed exchange system of the Bretton Woods system. That opened the door for the speculators. So that was August 15th, 1971. So from then until 1990 was one phase, and then after 1990 was the second phase of this looting process that was put in place for the benefit of these Davos billionaires. Now, people don't like the way they live today. People are not happy. I mean, some people drown their miseries with drugs or alcohol, or spend all their time on social media trying to get someone to like something that they do. But even people who do that recognize that they're not happy with the world as it is. And when Trump came along and spoke the truth about what a miserable character Hillary Clinton was, what a dangerous character, and did the same thing, remember, he destroyed the whole Republican machine. There were 16 candidates against him, led by Jeb Bush. Trump eviscerated them. He knocked out Clinton in the election. This was a moment where we could have changed things. And that's why the so-called deep state, the British Empire faction, went into overdrive to stop Trump. Now, he survived. He beat Russiagate. He beat Ukrainegate. And he did it because there were people like you, people like our organization, who were out there fighting every day to inform people what the real story is. Now, we've got to go into overdrive ourselves to make sure that this next 4-month period is one where we bring down this elite, which is very vulnerable. I mean, remember, they're sitting on the biggest bubble of worthless paper that's ever existed in world history. It's, the emperor's new clothes story. If enough people say, hey, why are we having a stock market boom when the companies whose stocks are going up are going into bankruptcy, like Hertz? So I think we have to get the story that you and I have been discussing this last hour. We have to get the story out as widely as possible. And I think the corruption is so blatant that it's going to be hard for them to hide it. Then it comes down to the question of, will we have enough people that can scare the Congress to be more scared of their constituents than they are of the bankers and the others who sign their checks?
Yeah, and for me, Harley, the bigger worry is, do we still have the moral fortitude? Do we still have the guts to stand up to this, or do we just acquiesce to defeat as a nation?
That's exactly what LaRouche was asking. Do we have the moral fitness to survive? And I'll say one thing about this, because I can't say that I'm a supporter of everything that Donald Trump does. But from watching him from close up in the campaign, and then since then, I've seen something that we haven't seen in the United States in a very long time. A president who had the guts to stand up to this entrenched bureaucracy. Now, he made concessions. You look at his cabinet, you look at people like Bolton, you look at Mnuchin. He's made concessions to them. But when it came to the question of his presidency, he stood up and fought. Had John Kennedy been so open about who his enemies were, they might not have been able to shoot him. And so Trump has survived, but he's in a very difficult situation right now because he doesn't control the economy. And the Wall Street crowd can pull the plug on the stock market just as quickly as they're letting it go up. And that would finish off Trump. So he's got to get out ahead of that and talk about the things that I've been talking about today, that the financial connection to Russiagate, to the endless wars, the endless bailouts. Get out there and do a series of what FDR used to call them, fireside chats, and not limited to tweeting, but actually talk to the American people. And I think we can get through this period, and then we'll really see what you and Mr. LaRouche are raising. Is there enough internal fortitude and moral standard in the American people to win this fight?
I'd like you to just conduct a part 2, maybe in a couple of weeks, because it's always beyond rewarding to talk with you about these things. You can dissipate some nonsense, and you have always given us some very, very solid facts. Harley Schlanger, thank you so much. Give us that little bit of data so that you can send a link, and if it's all right with you, I'll put that link right up on johnbwellsnews.com, and they can go to your blog straight from that.
Sure, please do. And the reason I give my personal email address is I like to get the back and forth with your listeners and with the listeners of people I have on various interviews. So if you send me an email to harleysch@gmail.com, that's harleysch@gmail, and tell me in the email that you heard this on Caravan to Midnight, I'll send you the link for free to my blog page so you can get my weekly articles. So that's my offer.
Very good.
John, I'd be happy to come back with you again at your convenience.
Absolutely, positively. I look forward to our next conversation. Take care out there, all right? God bless you. Goodbye for now.
Bye.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I say once again, I wonder how long the farewell word goodbye will be permitted in the American lexicon, since it's a contraction of God be with you. So when people say goodbye for now, that just means God be with you for now. It's like, no, God be with you always. And thank you so much for supporting Caravan to Midnight. You know why we exist. You just heard part of it. So, good night and goodbye.